Listen what I say. The captain is a tyrant and I no longer obey. I'm sick of taking orders from the madman in command. So let's drop him on an island and leave him in the sand, cause it's a mutant.
Okay, hello and welcome to a very special episode of the History of the Atlantic World podcast. I am your caffeinated host, Jesse Weiss. Thank you for joining us. And I do mean us today because I am delighted to be joined by Dr. A.B. Wilkinson. Dr. Wilkinson is a history professor at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, where he teaches courses on colonial North America, the U.S. Revolutionary Era, and early U.S. history. He has research and teaching interests in African American history, Native American history, ethnic studies, and critical race theory. So don't tell Donald Trump about this guy. Anyway, today we are here to talk about his new book, Blurring the Lines of Race and Freedom, Mulattoes and Mixed Bloods in English Colonial America. Dr. Wilkinson, or AB if I may, hello. Thanks for taking some time to speak with us today.
Hi, Jesse, and thank you for inviting me onto your show here today, and I'm looking forward to chatting with you.
Awesome. Yeah, I am as well. And I wanted to say, I really enjoyed reading your book a lot. One of the things that attracts me to history specifically is just like the human drama aspect. And there was a lot of that in some of the subjects you were talking about. And if you would you mind summarizing, I guess, beyond just saying, me saying it's about mulattoes and mixed bloods in colonial English America, what is the book about?
Yeah. Really when I came to this book, I wanted to answer a couple questions. One was, how did people of mixed ancestry first come to be identified as multiracial, or how did people really come to think about racial mixture in North America and the United States? But the United States, of course, took me back to the colonial period if I was really going to the origins of the story.
Gotcha.
And then secondly, I wanted to find out what people of mixed ancestry thought about themselves and the world around them. What was their world like? What was their perspective? So those were the two questions that I started off with. And really this book gets at those questions and answering them, and looking at how people of mixed ancestry were positioned within kind of the racial hierarchy that was burgeoning at the 17th century colonial period in North America and the Caribbean and the British colonial empire. And secondly, I was able to find, and it was difficult, and at first people had their doubts on my advisory board of whether or not I'd be able to find, how did these people think about themselves?
Right.
And that's just because it's really difficult to get at some of those sources of marginalized groups, people that were illiterate, didn't leave a lot of written records or primary sources of their own. But I was able to kind of read against the grain in many of the written sources, and even find written sources by people of mixed ancestry that spoke about their own lives. So that's really what the book is about. Within the British colonial context, I open up a little bit with Latin America, of course, because there is so much mixture throughout the Americas, and specifically in what becomes Latin America. But I really then use that as a jumping board to get into how the English saw things in terms of mixture and race. So that's it in a nutshell.
Oh, no, thank you. Yeah, that's exactly. Now, so one of the themes in the book is that these mixed ancestry people, or maybe I think you use the term mixed culture people at one point in the book, or you might have mentioned that, is the difficult choices that they could face through their lives. And one of the people you start with is I don't know if he's the very first person of mixed ancestry in colonial English America, but Thomas Rolfe in Virginia, who whose ancestry, I guess, left him with some dilemmas, I think, in his life. And anyway, his parents are pretty famous. Would you tell us a little more about who Thomas Rolfe is? If I'm saying his name right, I know his father, the Rolfe, I think, I don't know if I've actually ever pronounced that correct or not. I've just read the name, but.
No, and it's funny because sometimes I probably mispronounce these names, or, in some ways I would imagine that people pronounce names differently, and you can even see that.
Oh, yeah, right. Well, and tell me, I've been.
I go by Rolfe is fine. That's
I just wasn't. No, and I've been saying names in Nahuatl, the Aztec language lately. That was funny. I know they're all wrong.
yeah. No, so Thomas Rolfe, his father is John Rolfe, and his mother is Matoaka, or better known as Pocahontas, which was a childhood nickname, really. She revealed later on in life that her actual name was Matoaka, and she ended up taking on the name Rebecca when she converted to Christianity and married Thomas Rolfe. John Rolfe.
Yeah.
Had Thomas Rolfe, their firstborn and only son. So he was of both Powhatan and English descent. And he ended up growing up in England and then came back to the colonies. And really, one of the things that, maybe I should have mentioned this in the opening, that my book kind of gets at as well, is that people of mixed ancestry occupied these in-between spaces, or we might think of them as in-between spaces between, the racial terms, quote unquote, white and black, or white and Indian. And then there are people of mixed African and Native American ancestry too. And maybe we can get into that later on in the discussion. Yeah. But Thomas Rolfe, again, he is born in the Chesapeake in Senacomaca, which is what the Powhatan called that Virginia kind of Chesapeake Bay area. And so he's born there, and his parents take this trip over to England, and they go to London, and this is where we get really the only words that Matoaka or Lady Rebecca, Pocahontas ever spoke. It was recorded by John Smith. And no, she did not marry John Smith. That's the Disney story, but she married John Rolfe, who's another early settler in this colonial kind of Chesapeake, Virginia area. He's actually one of the first that starts growing tobacco in the region as well. And from the sources, we think that, excuse me, that's my phone there going off. From the sources, we actually believe that Native Americans really were helping the Virginians kind of plant and grow and cultivate some of these, some people call them, the crops from the Western Hemisphere of the Americas, indigenous to that area. So from the records we have, it looks like these cultures were very mixed from the beginning, or intermixing. And so definitely the cultures are always mixing, but I use the term kind of mixed heritage or people of mixed descent. Multiracial is kind of this idea around race and racial ideologies, and that's definitely being created during this time. But everyone's really a mix between their mother and their father, right? So
right.
Multiracial is a term that I don't necessarily use a lot, but it does appear in the book because I think people have become so used to using that term or that phrase.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, Thomas Rolfe has to make the decision to first, he grows up in England because his mother passes away, Matoaka, Lady Rebecca, she passes away in England, is buried there. And her husband, John Rolfe, comes back to Virginia, but leaves his son Thomas in England to be raised by Thomas's uncle, John Rolfe's brother. And so he's raised in the English culture, the Christian religion, Christian faith, but he doesn't know too much about his Powhatan ancestry, his Powhatan culture. And even though he was raised in that culture during his infancy before his mother passes away, because he's probably only like 1 or 2 years old, very
Gotcha.
young, at the time of his mother's passing. And so she probably, of course, spoke to him in an indigenous tongue in native languages from the Americas. And he is raised English, and he comes back to Virginia years later. I can't remember exactly how old he is, probably in his 20s or around 30, I believe, if memory serves me. It's in the book. Is what I was But then he has to kind of make this decision. Well, I imagine, let me say I imagine he has to make a decision of, how close is he going to be to these different cultures, because he is from 2 very different cultures, one Powhatan, Native American, right? And then the other English, European. And so he definitely lives within the English world and ends up, we believe, marrying an English woman. And Thomas and his ancestors, the Rolfes, really, then he marries in with, I think, the Bowling family, so the Rolfe Bowlings. They really grow up as English. And I don't remember if I put this in the book because it's some years down the line, but eventually I believe they even own African slaves as well. And they're a very prominent family. But yeah, there's definitely reimaginings and retellings of ancestry that relates back to Pocahontas, right? You have many people in the U.S. today that claim kind of that ancestry, and we are the descendants of Pocahontas, and John Rolfe.
Right.
That's right. But in actuality, probably most people have some type of Native American ancestry, and kind of latch on to that kind of popular culture and popular history of Pocahontas and that story. But it is real, and there are other stories just like it, and write about those as well. And I think I was mentioning another descendant the other day, just within my family, while we're on COVID lockdown. Johnny Depp is actually a descendant of one of the families, I believe, in the early chapters of my book as well, Elizabeth Key and
cool.
John Grinstead. So that's at least what I read. Now, I don't have the primary document.
Yeah.
Johnny Depp's a little bit of a mix of everything, supposedly. So,
yeah.
But yeah, those are the types of stories. That's the long answer to getting at that question there. But yeah.
No, and before we move on to, I think you spend some time in the book talking about, I guess if we lived in the 16 or 1700s, the term for a mixed race person in the English colonial world would just be mulatto, and that would be regardless of what your mixed ancestry was. I thought that was kind of like, in comparison, I guess, to the Spanish world, where they've got names for everybody. They're really interested in, I guess, in categorizing everyone. And the English, you could be a mulatto, might be someone who is mixed with African American or Native American ancestry. Or I just thought it was interesting that it wasn't always clear
right.
who these mulattoes were, I guess, or what their ancestry was.
Yeah, especially in the Chesapeake. And you're right, the English do not have nearly as many names or terms to use that they use to define people of mixed ancestry. Usually mulatto. There's another term that they do borrow from the Spanish. A lot of the racial terms that the English use, most of them are borrowed from the Spanish. But the English also use the term musty pretty regularly in the Carolinas, the Carolinian Low Country, especially around Charleston or Charlestown, depending upon how you want to pronounce that one. And so, yeah, they have a few terms: half-blood, mixed blood, people of mixed blood. These are the terms that the English use, but mulatto definitely is the one used most often for a person of mixed African, European, and sometimes Native American ancestry, or the mixtures between those 3 groups as well. usually mulatto is the term. But you do see, this term musty pop up very often in the Lower Carolinas and other places as well, but specifically in the Lower Carolinas. And they're shortening, the English are shortening the Spanish mestizo. And I've got that documented and pretty well proven in the book as well, that they're just, the English are shortening musti from mestizo. But a lot of these terms, the French use mati, which is, really, if you're kind of slurring the language a little bit, mati, musti, mestizo. That's something that I was kind of editing the book, and I'm like, oh my gosh, wait a minute, all these words kind of very similar in ways. And so you see in the book how Spanish mulattoes are entering into English territories as well, and they're bringing these terms along with their mixed heritage as well into the English colonies.
Now, one thing, I guess it shouldn't really have surprised me that much, but I guess I wasn't really familiar with the number of laws that are being passed in the Chesapeake, especially during the 17th century, regarding mixed ancestry people and this like constant refining of the legality of who these people are. And if you want to get into that process a little bit, that would be great. And in addition, this thought I had to myself, and later we'll talk about this, it'll be even more clear. Since like Virginia and I guess Maryland, they're so dominated politically and economically by tobacco farmers, who I guess these often are the legislators who are making these laws. And I mean, so we're to be clear, I want to, are we talking about people who are voting to enslave their own children?
In some cases, and this is an interesting point that you bring up. Yes, there are these planter politicians. Tobacco planters are the wealthy of the day. It's not too much unlike, if you want to think about who's in politics, I mean, who's the president right now, a lot of business people, a lot of wealthy millionaires and billionaires, though I think one of the things about the U.S. is we do have people that kind of come up and from nothing or very little and are able to become socioeconomically mobile. But during this time, that's very difficult. In this time period, you do see some of that, but there's a class hierarchy, and the class hierarchy is intersected with the racial hierarchy that is created, and the wealthy really are the ones who create that racial hierarchy through the law and within labor systems and around servitude and slavery. And so this is what these planters are doing in terms of creating a racial ideology to keep people in perpetual bondage. And Africans and Native Americans are eligible for slavery or lifelong servitude. Europeans are definitely there in servitude, but usually those indentures or those contracts that they're signing over in Europe and, England, many coming from Ireland as well, in the, I'm talking about the 17th kind of century period. But they'll sign their labor for passage, in exchange for the price of passage over to the Americas and the land in the Caribbean or in North America, where they'll serve out their time for that voyage, for the price of that voyage. And this is the class we're talking about. But then when you start to get into, Native Americans and Africans being brought in to these places, that service looks different, right? Because it's lifelong bondage, it's hereditary, very difficult to get out of it as the years go on. There's some mobility in the earlier periods, but what happens is you see these laws that are first written to distinguish between Europeans and non-Europeans, and they're usually based on religion. Christians, those of the Christian faith, And these laws quickly are understood by Africans and Native Americans who are converting to Christianity. And so what happens when an African slave says, well, I'm a Christian now, these laws shouldn't hold me in bondage any longer. And these Africans take their case to court, and the courts find, hey, these laws are written for Christians. And if one can prove that they're baptized, have godparents, are practicing the faith, they get their freedom. And so the planters quickly realize, well, we need to create another category. We need to keep these people in bondage through a different means of oppression, really. And this is where race and how race is created in the Americas. And the Spanish are already involved in this process, though there's a little bit of mobility, I would argue, within the Latin American context. The English, the racial system gets constructed within the 17th century, Chesapeake and the Caribbean. That's really where other historians, it's not just me who have found that. I'm really borrowing from the work of a lot of the greats who have come before me and written books on Virginia and the Caribbean and such. But when you get to mixed people, this is where I really kind of pull apart and look at, okay, how did these racial laws not only get instituted, but if you look at the first racial laws, like the first laws that are kind of designating who will be a slave and who is eligible for slavery, they're talking about the children. They talk about, well, because of the problems that have come up with these mixed children, we don't know where to place, say, the child of an African father and a European mother. And they have to, the planters, I shouldn't say they have to get creative to put these people in slavery. It's a choice, and they choose to create laws that keep people of mixed ancestry in bondage for as long as they can. Now, the difference between English kind of inheritance law and the law around slavery is paternity versus maternity. And within English law, we know that inheritance and the estate, those things are passed down through the father, through the paternal line. But when slavery is concerned, it makes it difficult where these slave masters, this is where you bring in the slave masters, to say, well, if it's a European man who gets an African woman pregnant, that child by paternal descent should be free. But because there is a fair amount of European men fathering children with African and Native American women who may be in bondage, they get creative with the law and they move slavery inheritance to the maternal line. And this is something that the Spanish and Portuguese are already practicing. Some of these things aren't even written in the books. It's really just de facto that people are operating. But then you start to get them written into law when the children, this is really where I find 1660s to the 1680s, Maryland and Virginia are the first to really enshrine this in law and say, well, when these children are born of an African mother and European father, they will be enslaved. But then what happens when you have these poor indentured servant women having children with African or Native American men? And those men might be in bondage, might be in slavery. Well, then they have an escape because they have free European maternal ancestry. And so Maryland and Virginia legislators get creative, and they essentially write these laws that keep these children of European mothers and African and Native American fathers in bondage for a term of 31 years. And so it's literally a space in between slavery, which would be lifelong, and servitude, which could be any number of years, but usually 4 to 7. Sometimes you see convict laborers, 10 years, 14 years, things of that nature.
Yeah.
But 31 years is smack dab in the middle. And it's really just with, I'm putting this in heavy quotations here, but these mulatto bastards and these cases of mulatto bastardy are where Virginia legislators and Maryland legislators get creative and institute these terms of 30 or 31 years. They eventually land on 31 years, but sometimes you see the early ones at 30 years. So yeah, that's what I found with this story, and that's where finding that people of mixed ancestry actually occupy in many cases an in-between area between white and black slavery and freedom.
And I thought that was very striking. The difference in the length of indentures that you mentioned in the book, that was very, very striking. And you mentioned that, and I think some people might be surprised that I think it's not that surprising, I guess, that to anybody who's listening, that men who own women as slaves would be essentially sometimes raping them or taking advantage of that situation. But I think some people might be surprised to find that there were a lot of, even in this very stratified society back then, unions between African or black fathers and white mothers. And one example, and I think you're a very good storyteller in the book, and you give a lot of examples, not of just these individuals that I appreciate. And one in particular, I thought you might want to share with the listeners is Anthony or Tony Longo and his family. And would you mind sharing a little bit about who he was and who this family was and some of the struggles that they faced in the 17th century, I believe, if I've written that down correctly?
Yeah. So, yeah, I really try to tell as much of the story as I can. And really with the 17th century, you're looking at records that are 400 years old. And when we go back to the 1600s, so they're piecemeal, damaged in a lot of cases. The writing is very difficult to read. And 17th century cursive is now my forte, but is for anyone having to learn it, it's very difficult. But I try to piece together as many of the stories as I can. And the Longo family is an interesting one. Anthony or Tony Longo is one of the first Africans in the Virginia area, and we believe that he gets his freedom at an early age from the documentation that we have. And this again is kind of that first generation. The Ira Berlin calls them the charter generation, I believe, of slaves that come in. And there are arguments that these slaves actually were able to operate more like indentured servants and able to get their freedom after a time of servitude. And we do have records that some do, though it's clear that most Africans probably were maintained in bondage, definitely during the 17th century. So Tony Longo has children. We know by one of European descent because his children are labeled as mulatto. It's not clear exactly who the mother is, and I will try to stay out of the woods, and just kind of, or the weeds of the woods, I suppose. But Tony is one who operates within Virginia as a free man of color, I guess we would say, right? And he, over his lifetime, sees his rights erode over the course of the 17th century. And that's because race is being crystallized. Race is, as an ideology, is being attached more to people of African descent and slavery, and kind of that dishonor and disrespect that we know is very historic within the U.S. and in colonial period. That is really being formed during this time. And so from the records I've found, he's an independent man, farms his own land, like several other, and probably dozens of others of free African families in the Virginia colony. And his children are indentured and really taken away from him because he falls into poverty He at some point is not able to financially support his children in some ways. Now, again, that this is somewhat unclear because the records I'm using are court records where he's having to take his case to court just to try to hold on to his children and keep them from being indentured out or essentially taken out of his household and put into the households of other wealthy European families in the Chesapeake. And so he writes the court asking that his children be returned to him. He's able at least to get a daughter, I think, out of servitude. And then his son James is the one I follow a little bit. And James Longo is able to get out of his indenture and ends up becoming moderately successful from everything that we can tell, though I've found his case later on, and some other people have also written about James Longo as well. But he's able to make a way for himself. I believe the family are carpenters and they do work for others in their community. And James, like his father, also gets into some trouble at times with the law. And some of those cases are very interesting because you can kind of see the resilience and the resistance, the struggle of this family through the generations. Anthony going into poverty, trying to just hold on to his children in his old age, so he's able to care for them, and so his children are able to care for him. And James ends up getting into some similar legal issues and goes to court over getting into arguments with neighbors and things of that nature. But from what I can tell, he buys his own land. He's able to farm his own land and is able to eke out a moderate, successful life for himself as a person of mixed descent or someone who's labeled as a mulatto. And some of that I attribute to what I found in many other cases is where these people of mixed ancestry do have a little more leeway than their African parents, and they're able to operate within society with a certain type of privilege at times. Now, it's a double-edged sword. Sometimes there's a mulatto privilege or a mulatto advantage, but obviously being of mixed descent also puts you at a disadvantage because you have African or Native American ancestry that Europeans and the elite, the colonial elite, are in power, and they look down on these people as well. And the laws are not in their favor much of the time, and the treatment that they get is discriminatory, prejudiced, and they have to work a little harder than the other European colonists in order to make a way out of no way sometimes. So that's a little bit about that story, and please ask follow-up questions if you want, since I can go on.
No, that's all right. When you mention that being mixed ancestry, if you were, say, being mixed ancestry could help you, I guess, if you were enslaved in some ways. One way that you talk about how some mulattoes were able to, at any rate, I guess, make a legal case to fight for their freedom. And especially in some of the northern colonies, they use religion, like you were mentioning earlier, I guess, as part of that case. And it strikes me that certainly would not have been possible for an African-American slave to bring a case like that, or I presume very much more difficult to get a case into court, at least.
It's more difficult, and you find it in the 17th century with anyone who's enslaved. They'll say, "Look, I'm Christian," and so there are Africans who do get their freedom based upon Christianity. There are several other cases, I guess. I won't pick out just one, but there's. And I should also bring up the ideology of hypodescent, which I haven't explicitly talked about.
I think I meant to ask you specifically to talk about that, and I may have skipped that somehow. But yeah, please. And also briefly, one more question I thought of regarding Tony Longo, since he he lived and had a little bit of success in his life in the 1600s. Do you think after 30 or 40 years later, after all of these new laws took into effect, is a little bit speculation, do you think his success would have been possible had he been born 50 years later?
Right. And that's a great question, and I can dovetail that into the hypodescent kind of answer.
Yeah, please.
So there is another case with the Davis family and a young woman named Rose Davis, and she does use this kind of Christian cultural attributes to sue for her freedom after a time of service and say, look, I'm not a slave. Her mother comes in and actually gives testimony as well for her. Her mother, Mary Davis, comes in and says, look, my daughter, Mary is from England. She talks about her family being English and of the Christian faith. And her daughter, Rose, is mixed, of mixed African and European ancestry. Their father is African, Rose, and one of her brothers. And her mother actually says in this court case that my daughter is of a Christian race. And she repeats it a few times. My daughter is of a Christian race. She talks about being from England, talks about that English ancestry, that connection to Christianity. And she says explicitly, I say this here to show you that my daughter is of a Christian race. And her freedom case is denied. And this is around, I want to say around 1715, if memory serves me correctly. And so by the early 1700s, no, Christianity does not get you freedom. And so you can see over the generations how the laws are changing, and I document that as well. But just how these ideas of race are changing as well. Race before could be cultural and some of these things tied to maybe the Christian faith in the 1600s. But again, that shift to the understandings around race being tied to whether it be, we wouldn't use the term biology back then, but ancestry, right? In African or Native American ancestry being kind of non-white. Even the English don't really use white in law until the 1680s, which is relatively late if you think about Jamestown being 1607, right? And so really where I can kind of tie in hypodescent here, I think with, going back to the Longo family, hypodescent is just the ideology, basically, it's a racial ideology or something that I've worked on. Other people have talked about hypodescent, but I think I really flesh it out in a way that other historians have not done yet. And hypodescent is just the understanding that if you have parentage from two different backgrounds, as we all do, and those parents are from two different levels on a racial ladder, that the child will occupy the status of the subjugated parent or the lower status parent. And I'm applying it to race here, but we could talk about caste and caste system, and just say, a child from two different castes or parentage has parents from two different castes would occupy closer to the lower caste status. And, we know about the one drop rule in the United States, that if you have one African ancestor for a long time, that made you African or African American. You can think about Barack Obama, right? And how he has a father from Kenya, and a mother who's of European descent from Kansas. And so, but Obama's black, right? Quote unquote black or
right.
Black. And so in the United States, this is something that, many of us are familiar with, still around today, that idea of the one drop rule, very applicable during the Jim Crow era, where you needed to distinctly and explicitly be able to tell who is going to sit on the back of the bus, who is going to drink out of the colored water fountains, right? And so we've had this understanding, of, well, if you have some African ancestry, well, you're African American, right? You're Black. Or during this time, they use the racial term Negro. And so what I've found is that the one-drop rule does not apply in the colonial period. And again, as I've already pointed out, these people who are termed mulatto have the leeway sometimes to occupy these middle spaces. And that's what some and many mulattoes, but not all. I mean, most mulattoes, most people of mixed heritage during this time are still in lifelong bondage. They would still be in slavery. But even in slavery, I found, and others have found this as well, right, that mulatto slaves many times occupy a higher status within the plantation, slave hierarchies, things of this nature. People of mixed blood or some European ancestry are looked upon during this time as somewhat higher than someone of full African descent. And so that's really what I'm talking about when I'm talking about hypodescent, that mixed ancestry elevates you compared to those who are fully colored or African and Native American. But that mixed ancestry will bring you down lower than someone who's European or quote unquote white racially. Gotcha. So there are these middle grounds or these middle spaces in between the races. And that's really what I'm talking about when I'm looking at these monoracial categories and people who really break out of what we think about in monoracial categories. And in some ways, the monoracial categories, again, are created
right
to keep these children aligned more with the subjugated ancestry or the perceived inferior ancestry, which is African and Native American.
Got it. I'd like to move into the 18th century, and specifically before we get finished with this, the one thing I definitely want to talk about more than anything is something that you wrote about in the book that literally gave me goosebumps when I read this passage. It's about a letter that was written in 1723. I believe from South Carolina, and it was sent to the Bishop of London, to the Bishop of London by an author who identifies himself.
I know what letter you're talking about.
Yeah,
the Virginia Mulattoes letter, right?
Yeah, and the guy who signs it, he says, quote, "As for myself, I am my brother's slave, but my name is secret," unquote. Would you like to please talk about that letter? I thought it was fascinating.
That's an interesting one. That's a great one. So I did not discover this letter. Another historian discovered this letter, and it was filed away in some weird place where it shouldn't have been. And we think that even though the letter originates in Virginia, that it might have went through Jamaica, because I believe, if memory serves me, it was in some of those records within the British. It might have been the British archives, actually. And it's a letter from people who identify themselves as slaves and identify themselves as, they write it as Virginia Mulattoes. And the language is very, or the writing is very difficult to read because there are a lot of misspellings. I kept all the misspellings and everything in the book. Because I wanted to get, again, I really like getting as close to the sources as possible, but you pick up that these people are struggling, right? That they are working to become literate. They're working in secrecy to even write this letter, but they're writing it to the new bishop in London, the head of the Anglican Church, or one of the heads, right? And they are really writing it as a petition. It's a plea to consider that, they're identifying themselves of English ancestry and saying, hey, we are treated worse than dogs. We are are brothers' masters, right? So they're insinuating there, or explaining really, that they are the children of their masters and their masters' slaves, and they identify that some of them have European mothers, some of them have European fathers, but they all consider themselves slaves. And I found that really interesting because by law, as I had mentioned before, those mulattoes who had English mothers should technically be what?
It should be free or indentured yeah.
But they say that we are enslaved for life. And so one of the other things I found in the book is that, well, that I illustrate in the book, is that even though on the books it says 31 years for these quote unquote mulatto bastards, in practice, de facto, these children are oftentimes being held for life. And the masters are selling the indentures, or selling the people and keeping the indentures, or changing the indentures. They're forging papers, or they just conveniently lose the indentures. And this is one of the things that I found with how power works in the colonial era with mixed people, is that the cards are stacked against them legally, and in practice. Because who holds the master holds the indenture, and so you're thinking, well, this child might not even know their origins. They might not know the laws. And really, the master is supposed to be obligated to free these children, but many times the economic incentive is not there, right? The economic incentive for these masters to keep the people in bondage for as long as possible. So and in fact, that's one thing about the letter. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, and I think you might even mention, in fact, too, even for a master who may intend on freeing his children. I think there were cases. I think you mentioned cases where that person dies, and someone else in the will or the bank or whoever may just seek to sell children who may have theoretically supposed to have been free, just to cover, debts, I guess, or stuff like that.
A lot of the family members that maybe got cut out of the will or didn't get as much as they thought they should, or executors of the estate. There are a lot of people that have a vested interest in keeping as many people in bondage as they can for as long as they can. And so these in the case of the Virginia Mulattoes letter, these are the people, and this is exactly where I was able to pick up on their voices. I mean, I had their voice right there in this 2 to 3 page letter, and they're identifying themselves as Christian, very much so. We're versed in the Bible, and that is why they're making this plea to the head of the church in England to consider our freedom. And it's a very moving letter. It's a very moving story, and you really pick up on just how dire their situation is, and what they're going through. Really, that is one of the stories that really moved me the most, and I think that's why I opened up chapter 4 with it. And so, yeah, I really appreciate that you appreciated that story, because it was very close to my heart as well.
Yeah, and part of me was wondering if, obviously, I think it's very easy to empathize with someone who would say, I can't really give you my name. And part of me was recently wondering if that's... would that be pretty common? I guess more common back then, where someone, I guess, for some of these mulatto slaves who would not be able to say their name. I assume that he would not be the only person who really isn't allowed to say that, I guess.
Yeah, let me explain that part a little bit. I could go a little bit further there. The letter's written in 1723. And we believe that there were a number of slave conspiracies in the early 1720s, 1722, around then in Virginia. And so the awareness of the European population in the colonial Virginia, they're very aware of slave movements. They've got their ears open for anything that could look like a conspiracy for rebellion or revolt. And so any slaves that are found,
Gotcha.
making any pleas for freedom,
Right.
or joining together to write a letter, because there's one person who's literate in writing this letter, but this person is representing a number of people. He identifies. We believe it's a he. I believe it's a he, though I'm not sure. It could be a woman, though. It's more likely that it would have been a man during this time, and some of the language used leads me to believe that it could have been a mulatto man. But he's representing men and women, I assume, in the letter,
Yeah.
and saying, hey, we are treated this way. They're joining together in secret, and he does use that language. He says, look, we're meeting in secret. My name is secret. Definitely doesn't sign it. We don't know who wrote it, but everything about the letter rings true in terms of what we know about the situation of the people in these positions. And if this person and these people were caught joining together, making a plea for mass liberation, is essentially what it is, and could be really one of the first letters from any slave in colonial Virginia. I'm not aware of any writing from a slave earlier than 1723, though we're always finding new stuff, and I'm sure somebody's got a book out there somewhere with something. But it's a very early look, first person look, really, at what life is like for the slave and for people of mixed heritage in bondage. And so, yeah, if they're caught, I think there's a line, and I have to open up the book and page through it, but
Yeah.
I think he even says, the writer, the anonymous writer even says, if I were to be caught with this letter, I would swing upon the gallows tree. And
Yeah.
it's the reality of punishment is there, and it's very real. It comes through in the letter, and from everything that I know about this time, we're talking about torture, we're talking about death or banishment for
Yeah.
any that would lead to insurrection like this.
I think one of the, I guess how do I want to frame this? I guess one of the real tragedies, I guess, of the rise of hypo descent and all of this is that many Africans and Native Americans and mixed heritage people, you say, also, quote, imbibe this philosophy, unquote. And this gives birth to colorism. Would you like to talk about what is colorism, and what's the impact of this for mixed people and for others? I guess, just for African Americans and everything, I suppose too, for sure.
So skin color preference and treatment, people, basically colorism is people with lighter skin are more likely to advance in society. It's something that we see today. It's something that we see in the past. And not many historians, I find, have really, there are references to the house slave, being more likely to be of mixed heritage, but that's not always the case, actually, when you look back at some of the records. Definitely is true that mulatto slaves oftentimes hold higher positions within the plantation system, but not always. And dark-skinned Africans work in the houses as well, the master's house, and sometimes hold high positions as well. But the general trends, and there are some studies that have shown this, I believe in the early U.S. period, but no one's really gone back to the colonial period as far back as I've gone and really kind of tried to unpack where does this colorism come from? Where does this idea that the lighter skinned slave will have some type of preferential treatment come from? And we really could see it almost in the last letter that we talked about by those Virginia mulattoes, because they're making the argument really in that letter. And I kind of cracked that thing open a little bit. They're not arguing for mass slave liberation for everyone. They're saying, we are mixed, we deserve our freedom because we have some English ancestry and we're Christians, right? And so this idea of colorism really is born in the colonial period, I would argue. And I have documented it in places, but again, it's really hard to find because you don't have records written by slaves saying in the slave quarters, well, I get treated poorly because I'm darker skinned within the slave community, but that person who's mixed over there, they have lighter skin, maybe some European features, a smoother hair texture. These are the things within the African American community that we know, and I guess I really didn't identify myself as a person of mixed descent myself, but I'm of African, European, and Native American ancestry myself, and we know within the African American community that there's light skin privilege, even if we're all African Americans,
right,
to some degree, and so. This place of social advancement, is in the slave quarters. It's in the colonies. It is imbibed by people of mixed ancestry as well. And there were some cases where I was able to find people of mixed descent who say, well, we don't associate with Negroes, quote unquote. And you find it and you got to write about it. I mean, it's not something that you're happy about to find, because
right,
people kind of imbibing the philosophy of the master. But this is how would I say it, in sometimes the word white supremacy I know can be jarring for people, but this is how white supremacy works, right? Is that even people of color will borrow from or adopt the philosophy of the master. And that's what you have with colonization. And this is what you have within communities of color in the colonial period and sometimes even up to today. Yeah.
And I guess I want to say thank you very much I want to ask you one more question, I guess, before I let you go. But we didn't. You talk about this a bit in the book. We haven't really spoken about it, but how there's different. I guess the Chesapeake is only in the colonial period. You're really talking about multiple British Americas, kind of almost, and they're very similar in some ways, but. You mentioned that it's the Chesapeake, and this is why you studied the Chesapeake colonially. Is that's the quote, the incubator for the more stringent version, of hypo-descent philosophy that came to dominate in the United States, unquote. Why the Chesapeake? Why? What is it? Because it seems like Charleston has more. It seems like I don't know if there is really an answer to this, or if you have an idea, but it seems like maybe Charleston would have more clear laws, I guess, or whatever their version. If you understand what I'm saying, what I'm getting at, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. Why the Chesapeake? And I also call it the epicenter, I think, of hypodescent as well. And it comes down to demographics. Demographics is the quick answer. I mean, this book is what, 250 pages?
Yeah, no, it doesn't have to be a complicated answer. Sometimes
it is nuanced, but really when we look at demographics, and that's another thing that I was able to, fortunately, in painstakingly, but I got a lot of help from the people that have come before me in the books that I've read, and some of my research assistants who quantified a lot of data for me as well. And I got to give them a shout out, because I was able to look at the numbers and then really just with my other expertise around some of these histories, able to ascertain that South Carolina and the Low Country looks more like the Caribbean. In the Caribbean, you're talking about 9 out of 10 people in the Caribbean are of African ancestry. And so mixture isn't quite demonized in the same way that it is in places where there's a more even mix of European and African peoples. And in the Chesapeake, it's the earliest successful English colony, right? But there's also a settler colonialism there that's very unique, and that they really try to separate themselves first from Native American peoples. And then, even though they're bringing in Africans for labor, they do try to keep the races separate in a very early period of North American history. And so this is where you get the Chesapeake being kind of the incubator for the stringent versions of hypodescent. There are large populations in Virginia, in Maryland, to start, that exceed the Low Country in South Carolina and even some of the Caribbean islands. And this is where you will have the fear of mixture amongst Europeans, especially the elite. And again, I would tie it back maybe to the earlier parts of our conversation, in that the elite want to keep power. And in order to keep power, you have to have control of labor, or at least that's one method. Again, I shouldn't say you have to. That's a choice. That's a choice that they make. I have to remind my students this too, because I think sometimes the way we look at history, and we look back and we say, well, they had to do it this way, or they had to have slavery. Power this way. Not necessarily. You can keep power by treating people fairly and being just and equitable leaders too. That's another way to keep power, but they choose to do it another way, right? And so they're trying, the leaders, again, these planter politicians are trying to keep the peoples separate in order to maintain control over labor. And so this is really where they must distinguish between who is white and who is black, or they choose to distinguish who is white and who is black. And they choose to locate people of mixed ancestry along with those of African descent, African and Native American descent, because there is Native American slavery and servitude as well. And so that's really why the Chesapeake, in the short and quick of it, they have a large indentured servant population as well. And those servants are also mixing in with Africans and Native American slaves. And so this is really where those elites see a problem with mixture, and really almost in a way create the idea that there is a racial mixture problem. And this is something that is an ideology that carries over and carries down and recreates and is structured differently over the time for the next 300 plus, probably about 300 years into the 1900s and the Jim Crow era, and 1967 with Loving versus Virginia, where the Supreme Court finally got rid of laws that prevented so-called interracial mixture, or what they called miscegenation by that time. And the Supreme Court in the 1967 case of Loving versus Virginia overrules these anti-miscegenation laws and gets rid of them. But again, my book is trying to go back and find out how they ever got to these understandings.
Well, I want to say, again, I think you do an excellent job of that. The folks, for if you're listening, I guess as far as the legal history of this goes, this is an excellent book. And Dr. Wilkinson, I want to say thank you very much for your time. I don't think I mentioned this to you earlier, unless I emailed it to you. I am going to put a link to your website on there. I think it's got a link to your book on there as well in the show notes for this episode. And if not, I'll put a separate. I'll give you a couple of links in there. It was a delight to chat with you. And anybody out there listening who is interested into history for the same reasons I am, the human drama of it all, I highly recommend this book, which is, once again, Blurring the Lines of Race and Freedom, Mulattoes and Mixed Bloods in English Colonial America. All right, folks, thanks.
Hey, fellow pirates, come and listen what I say. The captain is a tyrant and I no longer obey. I'm sick of taking orders from the madman in command. So let's drop him on an island and leave him in the sand. Cause it's a mutiny. It's a mutiny. It's a mutiny. And now we're taking over the ship. It's a mutiny. It's a mutiny. It's a mutiny. And now we're taking over the ship. Shit. Haven't you heard what's happening here? You're no longer in control and we're drinking up your beer. This is now a democratic, egalitarian pirate ship. So enjoy your trip, cause it's a mutiny. It's a mutiny. This is a mutiny. And now we're taking over the ship. It's a mutiny.